Today on Living History, we're talking with Chris Reiterman.
Yeah, Ogilvy, we were the first advertising agency for Shanghai Volkswagen at that time, and we did the Santana launch campaign. That ad today, I think it still holds up pretty well, even compared to what many of the car brands do today. But when we kind of go back into, what is the great stuff we've done in China over the last 30 years, definitely the Santana launch ad will always stand out.
Today, we're speaking with Chris Reiterman. Chris is the Asia-Pacific CEO of the advertising agency Ogilvy and the president of WPP in China. Chris was born in Germany and was an early student at the East Asia Institute in Ludwigshafen. His first trip to China was in 1994, where he continued his studies at Tongji University in Shanghai and did his first internship at Ogilvy, where he quickly began rising through the ranks. Ogilvy has been involved with many famous advertising campaigns in China. They made the first TV commercial for the Volkswagen Santana. They worked on the 2008 Beijing Olympics. They helped Chinese creativity get noticed around the world. And for more than 30 years, Chris was there for it all. About these and many other memories, we're very happy to talk with him today. Chris Reiterman, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me, you first arrived in China in 1994. That first trip, I think you said your plane almost crashed.
Yeah, it was, like the entire journey to China was, most of it was not really planned. I was actually on my way to Shanghai with a plan to study at Tongji University. But then I somehow got stuck in Thailand. We kind of decided, instead of going to Shanghai, we first visit Vietnam or something. So we did a motorbike trip through Vietnam and then ended up in Hanoi and bought a plane ticket to Guangzhou for some bizarre reason, because that was probably the cheapest or something. And then the plan was that we're going to take the train from Guangzhou to Hangzhou, because Matze, my friend that I was with, he was studying at Hangzhou University. So the plan was to drop him off there first. We kind of got to Guangzhou, went to the train station, and I think it was just before the October holiday. And there were like millions and millions of people. There were like people sitting on like those tennis umpires. They had these high chairs and wooden sticks and would like kind of beat people into the right lanes to get to their platform. So like, okay, let's not do that. And there were no tickets. So we went back to the airport, bought a ticket to Hangzhou, flew to Hangzhou, and I'm not a very keen flyer anyways. But we were on this plane, and literally it went into free fall twice. And we were like all like kind of like this. So we landed in Hangzhou, completely shaken of that plane trip. And then we got our luggage, went out of the airport, and there was a massive fight. Some taxi drivers or something had some massive brawl. So that was my first kind of 24 hours in China. We eventually got out of the airport and made our way to Hangzhou University. So that was day one in China. Yeah.
In those early days, when you were traveling in China, most people here would not have met a foreigner before, much less a foreigner who could speak Chinese. Did people talk to you? What would they want to ask from you?
I think, those days, you were definitely a bit of an anomaly and something special as a Western foreigner. And for example, when we went to the train station in Guangzhou, there are not only people from Guangzhou, there were people from like everywhere in China, and probably some of them maybe saw a foreigner for the first time. So, in those days, you had people come to you and like want to touch your hair or touch your skin or just come talk to you. So you were, much more special than you are now. And in many ways, in a cute way, people just wanted to, talk to you and know things. And then obviously, if you spoke some Chinese, it was usually a very interesting conversation. And often you got very bizarre questions too.
Like what?
When you told anyone you're from Germany, the first answer you would get is like, xi de le,很厉害. So, and then, you say, hey, no, this guy wasn't a good guy. I said, no, a great leader. So he had quite a good reputation, I guess, in China those days. But, often just questions about where you're from, your family, what you do here, how you came here, stuff like that. But people were very interested, I think, in why you're in China.
And so am I, actually. Even today, it's very rare for foreigners to study Chinese before they're even in China. And back then, it was even more rare. What got you first interested in?
It now looks like I was very visionary, but the truth is I wasn't. As a child, we moved around quite a lot, my family, so I was always, I think, quite international. And I wanted to study something that's exotic. I definitely wanted to study something that gave me a chance to, have an international career. I spoke English, I spoke French, so that wasn't very attractive to me. And then the options are not that many. And then I stumbled across this kind of new thing, which actually at that time wasn't really an official course yet. I think it was just like a trial or pilot program called East Asian Management or Business Management. And they had two options at that time, which was Japanese or Chinese. And I had no idea of Japan or China. I've never been to Asia, but I thought that sounds quite exotic. And my first tendency was to do Japanese, but then for some reason I ended up in the Chinese course. So it wasn't like very, planned or strategic. It was just kind of like I wanted something that's very exotic and very different. And I didn't want to study just the language. So this was kind of a good mix of business and everything else you need to know when you pursue a career in Asia.
What happened to the other students who studied Chinese with you?
It's actually a mix. Definitely quite a few ended up in China, and some of them are still in China. But not that many, actually. When you think about, over the last 30 years, how many people graduated from this course, I think probably a much bigger group of people did not end up in Asia or China. So I think there's a few pioneers that went to China right away, and I do think that's probably the key to it. The people that are actually still here are people that probably went quite immediately after graduating or very early in their career. Because if you start at a company in Germany or somewhere else, the chance that eventually you will get sent to China are not that high. So a lot of people that ended up in China, and we have like a WeChat group. I think we're like 100 of us. So I don't know if all of them are in China or still in China, but there's quite a few that are still in China.
And you did come right away to China. You went to Tongji University to study there. How's being in a Chinese university in the 1990s different from being in a German university?
Obviously, very different, huge difference. First of all, at the time when we were studying in Germany, because it was kind of a pilot course, it didn't even have a proper building. So we were not even in the main campus. We were like, I think they leased 2 classrooms in an elementary school or something like that. So it's very basic. So I never, at least in my own study experienced like a big campus and all that kind of stuff. Then when we got to Tongji University, obviously a huge school, huge campus. And at that time, as a foreigner, you had to live in the foreigner dormitory, where Chinese people weren't allowed to go in. They could go in the common rooms or area in the ground floor, but they couldn't come to your room. They couldn't officially kind of enter. So you were a bit isolated, but you can go out, you can go through the campus, you can interact with all the Chinese students. And at that time, I think Fudan and Tongji, they're quite close to each other. So there was kind of like a whole life around those two campuses. There's lots of bars, restaurants where people would go. So it was quite nice.
How was dating in a Chinese university as a student?
I don't know. I didn't date. It was, we got there quite late, so it was quite interesting because at that time all the students had to live in the foreign dorm, and the dorm itself was kind of like segregated by country and race. So quite funny. So they had, European students, Japanese students, Korean students, African students, Arab students. And because we got there late, there was no more room in the dorm. So we ended up in the Arab floor. So me and my other German friend, we ended up having a room on the Arab floor, which was very interesting because many of them came with scholarships from Chinese government, and many of them were PhD students. So they were much older than us, and they came with their wives, and they were cooking, and because maybe they didn't want to eat Chinese food, so every Friday they came with a goat that they slaughtered, and so we had very good food, and we were right next to the prayer room. So during Ramadan and all this kind of stuff, we had like every morning at 3 o'clock, we were up listening to the prayer. But very nice guys, many friends, and actually some of them are still in Shanghai as well. So.
How do your friends react when you're back home in Germany to your memories, to your stories?
I don't think anyone that hasn't experienced that kind of life will ever really understand it or comprehend it. I have still some very good friends, even though I left Germany 30 years ago. They've lived their entire life in some small village in Germany. They cannot ever understand the kind of life you had and experienced. And I also stopped trying to kind of explain it to them. It's a totally different world. When you kind of live most of your life in a foreign country, and a lot of your friends are kind of similar people that experienced similar life, that grew up internationally. So obviously those people can relate much more to the life you have experienced.
Let's talk about advertising a little bit, because in 1995 you started at Ogilvy, the famous, the glamorous advertising agency, first as an intern, and they were making the first TV commercial for the Volkswagen Santana in China, which is a car that was extremely influential here. What was it like to make that, and how did people react when the first commercial came out?
Yeah, Ogilvy, we were the first advertising agency for Shanghai Volkswagen at that time, and we did the Santana launch campaign, and for many years all of their communication in China. Actually, when you look at that ad today, I think it still holds up pretty well, even compared to what many of the car brands do today. But it was a quite epic campaign.
桑塔纳，走遍天下都不怕。
and we got a lot of great reviews, and the car was extremely successful for 25 years. When we kind of go back into what is the great stuff we've done in China over the last 30 years, definitely the Santana launch ad, will always stand out. And when you think about it, was, I think, a 2-minute commercial. When you look at that campaign, it kind of takes you through a journey through China. It's kind of like, very much the kind of let's all go. So it was a pretty nice piece, I think, and something we're proud of.
I think the main message was, anywhere I can go, I can rely on it, I can feel confident, right?
Yeah.
By the late 1990s, you had experienced, of course, living in Germany, living in New York and London, in Hong Kong and in China. And I'm wondering, how was living in China different at in those days?
I know, China at that time, and maybe to some people still today, is just so different to a Western lifestyle, right? So you live in London, you live in New York, you live anywhere in Europe, you can fit in immediately, right? Here, you will always stand out, right? And that's something you don't experience living anywhere else, right? Because as a Westerner, you just always fit in. Plus, you have a very, very different culture here, right? At least in my view, there's a certain character that works very well in China. And, often I think people, a lot of companies train their management when they move to China, when they go to China, they get cultural training, all this kind of stuff. But often that doesn't really work very well. And people, I experienced some people that had the most success in China, were loved by Chinese people, never spoke a word of Chinese, never had any training, but it's a certain character, I think, that fits. And I think that character is, someone that's kind of earnest, someone that doesn't think too highly of himself, someone that Chinese people will, yes, respect for certain knowledge that you have, but not someone that comes in and say, hey, I'm the guy, let me tell you how to do things. That doesn't work very well. So I do think it's easy to blend in, and it's easy to get along if you have the right kind of traits.
I was looking at your guys' website, and these days, pretty much all of your management, all of the employees that are listed on there are Chinese. What was it like when you first came to China, when you started joining Ogilvy?
Obviously, we had a lot more foreigners then. When you think about it, right, advertising in China is basically 30 years old, right? So before that industry didn't exist, more or less. So obviously, in the late 90s, most of the senior people were from outside of China because you just didn't have the talent locally, right? Now you do have that talent locally. There's amazing people in this industry. So like in every other more mature market, obviously you need less foreigners to do things that in the past maybe you did need foreigners for.
When did you notice that changing?
I think it's a gradual change. I mean, for us, until 2015, probably, we still had, a lot of our most senior people were foreigners. And ever since then, it just gradually less and less and less. And now, I think we have 3% of our total employees are foreigners, but that includes, a lot of Chinese with foreign passports. So Westerners, we have 3. So and all of them are kind of long-time China residents. So basically, no more expats.
What kind of foreigners in those early days were attracted to coming to work for you guys in China?
I think it was a mix of people. I think some people were just curious. They heard, okay, China something is happening. It's, growing. It's kind of waking up, giant waking up. So they were, some were attracted to the culture. Some thought it's a good thing for their career. So you got a mix of people. But late 90s to 2010, 2015, you could attract some of the best global talent to come to China in our industry. Now it's gotten much more difficult because the market has become more domestic. It has become more isolated. There's no doubt. So, for many people, it's maybe not as much as it used to be, kind of a stepping stone in their career. So when you look, 2005, 2015, that kind of time, many people that moved to China as China CEO for many multinational companies ended up being the global CEO. I think now that probably wouldn't be a natural process anymore. And, many multinationals now, their CEOs are local Chinese.
What was it like to move to Beijing in the first place? Because, again, not a lot of foreigners.
Nope. I mean, Beijing was, at that time, I loved it. And I think everybody loved it.
What year?
1999. So I mean, it wasn't the first time I came to Beijing, but that's when I moved to Beijing. And because Beijing was so different to any other city, even like Shanghai, it just felt you're in China. It just felt very Chinese, and it felt a bit rough, a bit kind of grungy, a bit, lots of culture. It was really, really so different. And I remember the first time I came to Beijing to interview for my job in Beijing. I was at our Taipei office before that. At that time, there was a guy called Scott Silverman. He was running the office, I think. When I came to the office, he said let's go for a walk. So we didn't even talk in the office. We went for a walk, and he said I need to buy some apples. So we went to a local market, and our office was in the middle of nowhere somewhere in the old carpet factory. And we walked through back roads, went to the market, went to buy apples. And then we talked about what he wanted me to do. And I was like, this sounds like good fun. And there were a much closer knit community of expats at that time because there just weren't that many. There weren't that many places to go. So, probably 2-3 bars where everybody went to. So everybody knew everybody met all the time. Everybody tried to help each other because we were all kind of in the same boat trying to make it work. So it was a really nice time to be in Beijing. And it was, I think, culturally amazing. It was, lots of things kind of happened for the first time. Audi was one of our clients, so we did a race around Tiananmen. Don't even remember when it was, 2004, 2003 or something like that. So they brought some Le Mans racing cars and did a race around Tiananmen. Probably it would be more difficult to do that today. There was a very famous fashion show at the Great Wall. Don't remember what it was. Karl Lagerfeld, I think. I think it was Karl Lagerfeld. Lots of weird stuff happening, but very, very interesting times. There was one bar that kind of everybody went to called Vogue. I remember Quentin Tarantino was in Beijing shooting Kill Bill. And that was the only bar he could go to. So we were kind of partying with Quentin Tarantino for 6 months. Uma Thurman would show up sometimes. And, random things like this would happen all the time, which made it a pretty interesting life in Beijing, I guess. There was a very famous bar called No Name Bar at Hohai, a lake. That's where everybody would just hang out and share stories, and this is good. I think now today, because everything is much simpler, I guess, and much more developed and sophisticated, I think most foreigners go their own lives, and there's maybe a bit less of that community and bonding and shared experience than it was 30 years ago.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was when you guys won the Motorola account. And I have been imagining what it must have been like for the agencies who were in America, in other places, to be beaten by a Chinese outpost, by somebody who was probably not on their radar before as a creative force, and then realizing, oh shit, China is really arriving. Maybe take me back to those days. Tell me what it was like.
Actually, the Motorola was quite interesting. I mean, when you think back, before Apple, basically there was Nokia, there was Motorola, they were dominating the mobile market. And actually for both of them, China was probably their biggest growth market and their biggest market at that time, because everybody was buying mobile phones, so you had the opportunity to sell 1.3 billion phones. So it wasn't like we beat agencies outside of China, but China was such a huge priority for Motorola and for Nokia. We worked for both, actually. That they thought, actually, why don't we do a lot of that work in China, because it has to work in China first. That's our biggest number one business priority. And that was not just for Motorola, it was for many multinational companies like that, that China was such a big priority that they said, let's make it work in China first. And then if it works in other places, even better. Then we started to set up a huge team in Beijing. And this was... I don't know if you remember the Razr, Motorola Razr. It was like the hottest phone for a couple of years. We were doing all that work from Beijing, and we had a huge international team doing work for the US. Quite amazing when you think back. We shooting with Annie Leibovitz, with the most famous directors, most famous photographers, huge production budgets, doing global work from our tiny office in Beijing.
Hello, Moto.
There was probably 3-4 years that lasted. Then, unfortunately, there was nothing after the Razr, so things got a little bit more tough then.
You said from your little office. How many people were you, and what was that like, that office?
It's like I said before, like Ogilvy started in China in '92. In Shanghai. We set up an office in Beijing a bit later, I think 95, 96, something like that. But it was very small. And it was really in the kind of late 90s that it started to take off. We had an office in Beijing largely because of IBM. So that was our biggest global client at that time, and IBM had a big priority and focus on China. So we basically set up the office for them or with them. And then in '99, when I came, we just had set up, was kind of the dawn of the internet. So we set up a company called Ogilvy Interactive, which was kind of the digital guys. And the only thing we forgot at that time that there were only 4 million internet users in China. So there wasn't that much business to be had yet. So we started doing CD-ROMs and stuff like that. And we built kind of the first websites for some of the multinational companies in China. But there was no audience, basically. It was just kind of a new emerging thing, and we had kind of a separate room in the office where we had all these kind of weird people, a lot of foreigners, because at that time nobody knew anything about the internet in China. So we had some, I think, a Norwegian CTO, and we had some crazy creative guys that probably knew how to do some Flash programming and things like that. And then that's what I ended up doing. I kind of started to run Ogilvy Interactive.
像这种外企公司，通常都在实施一种责任制，员工常会自愿加班，有时一天24个小时都在忙着公司内的大小事情，只为在最短的时间内将工作完成，并且尽量做到最好。但他们的老板却对每位员工的工作表现有些不同的看法。
I didn't know anything about interactive or digital at that time. But that was very good fun. There's a couple of years where we are huge growth, and everybody thought, the internet will change everything. So we got like a few years where nobody asked us about numbers and profit or anything.
我们这边就算是一个多国部队了，来自于不同的这个国家和地区，所以大家的这种合作都基本上是说，就是会不会就是被这样的感觉，就是做事情。
因为在这几年，可能北京迅速的发展，它吸引了很多很多的外企来这儿做投资，以及很多外籍人员都来这边准备做一些长期的事业的发展嘛，所以在这儿让我感觉它更像一个国际的都市，比台北可能有更多的外国人在这工作。
就是比较友好，我觉得比较友好的一个地方，还有某些方面比较轻松，比伦敦轻松多了。这伦敦真的太贵了，什么东西都买不起。北京是价格，我觉得是价格的差别是最主要的。
I think we had very quickly, 300-400 people doing interactive stuff for 4 million internet users. But we were definitely pioneers in that space, and that I think also helped Ogilvy overall to kind of change, evolve, transform, and stay current. But it was interesting times. I remember we built the first website that we ever did in China was for Mondelez. I think it was at that time it was called Craft. So it's a tiny little website with 20 pages, and we got paid huge money to do it. So,
And now the internet is everything in China.
Probably today we would get paid $20 to do that kind of work. But at that time it was...
The Beijing Olympics in 2008 were also a huge coming out party for China. And Ogilvy China was deeply involved through Johnson & Johnson. Tell me a little bit of what happened. How did that go down?
It wasn't just Johnson & Johnson. Many of our clients, were involved in the Olympics. And for us, it was obviously a very good business to be had leading up to the Olympics. And, there was massive energy, I think, in Beijing in the kind of 3-4 years leading up to the Olympics. Everybody was there. Everybody wanted to be part of it. It's really a great time to be there, and we were very privileged to work with many of our clients on whatever their involvement was in the Olympics, and we actually also worked with the Olympic Committee. So we did a lot of work for the Beijing Olympic Committee through our PR business, and but particularly Johnson & Johnson, it's always a story I like to look back to because I was involved in it quite a bit. Actually, Johnson & Johnson, they sponsored they were the main, one of the main sponsors, top sponsors of the Olympics, which they only did once in their entire company history. And that was because they wanted to kind of promote Johnson & Johnson in China. So they really just did it because the Olympics were in China. And they became not a China sponsor. They became a global sponsor, but really China was the only thing they were interested in. And they did a global pitch for their Olympic campaign on Easter Sunday, I remember, in Shanghai. They had their global CMO, global CEO, everybody was there. And they had, every agency on earth kind of showed up to present. And we presented a campaign, and we had, our global CCO was there, everybody was there. Presented a campaign to them, and at the end of the meeting, we weren't the last agency to present, but we presented, and basically at the end of the meeting, they said, okay, you got it. They absolutely fell in love with the line that we presented, called Yin Ai Shang, which still today we haven't quite figured out how to translate it into English. But they just loved that line, and they said, okay, it's yours. So we knew kind of, at the end of the meeting that we won that business. And then we did all the, all the campaign work for Johnson & Johnson around the Beijing Olympics. And also because of our involvement, I was very lucky to get, I was at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, which was super interesting as well. It was, I think, the hottest I've ever been in my life. I think that day was like 40-something degrees centigrade, and you had to be there a few hours before, and then the whole thing took a couple of hours. But it was just an amazing experience to just be there.
A lot of people told us when in the early days they would do marketing efforts to start things like the Hard Rock Cafe to bring Häagen-Dazs to China. So many people would show up because it was so special. And you had mentioned you guys shut the whole bund down with Hershey's as well. What happened there?
That was quite funny. That was actually when I was doing my internship at Ogilvy Shanghai. Hershey's was a client of ours, and they have these Hershey Kisses, those little kind of thingies. So they did kind of a event at the Bund. It was 95, and so they put this gigantic almond kiss at the Bund, and they had people handing out free chocolate. And you know how the Bund is on a Sunday, and that time even more so. There were millions of people, and then I guess the word spread that someone is giving out free chocolate. So basically, that almond kiss had it's kind of like a fluffy almond kiss that 3-4 people standing there, including myself, by the way, were handing out chocolate, and there were just thousands of people coming, and there was no barriers or anything, so they kind of kept on pushing. So the police had to come to kind of restore order because they were all grabbing the chocolate. It was quite interesting. But we really got mobbed for these little chocolates.
My God! And you were also at the first McDonald's. What was that like in those early days? Were people really lining up around the block?
I didn't see people lining up around the block, but I know they did. That time it was a new thing, obviously, and everything Western was kind of interesting, weird, kind of funny because not really what Chinese people would like to eat, right? But it was a new thing. It was a Western thing, and so people would just try it out. And there was only one McDonald's at a time in Beijing. So I think I showed you a picture. I was sitting in front of that McDonald's in '94. To us foreigners, it was because there wasn't a lot of Western stuff in China at that time. So to us, kind of going to McDonald's was kind of once a month, your refuge or your memory of home or something. So going to McDonald's was quite a big thing especially for students at that time to have your burger once a month. Meant a lot.
What was your favorite Chinese food in those days?
My favorite Chinese food, actually, it's quite I think my Chinese in the beginning, I wasn't probably a huge fan of Chinese food, but it actually evolved over time. And now I would maybe say I'm more of an expert in Chinese food. I like spicy food, so like Hunan food, something that I like. Guizhou food, I like. So there's different Yunnan foods, very nice. I think people outside of China, they always probably think Chinese food is just Chinese food. It's like fried noodles and Beijing duck. What most people don't know is that you have massive variety by region, and there's spicy, sweet, sour, potatoes, rice, everything. So quite a huge variety of cuisines in China, which is great.
At this point, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our project. The period between China's opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping and the 2010 Shanghai Expo deserves to be remembered. We want to collect the memories that Chinese, Americans, and other foreigners made together during these times. We hope you will subscribe to our channel to see many more interviews like this one in the coming weeks. If you too have a story that you think needs to be remembered, we would very much like to hear from you. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Shanghai for their generous support. Without their sponsorship, we would not have been able to start this channel.
Do you think it was easier or more difficult in the 1990s when you arrived?
I think it was maybe more difficult from a regulatory point of view because at that time many things weren't quite figured out. It was maybe a bit easier from a market point of view because it was just such a fast-growing market, and there was scarcity in many things, right? So at that time, small company, big company, as long as you made a decent product, you probably can sell it. As long as you had, a decent service or whatever, you could probably sell it. Now it's gotten much more difficult because the market has matured. There's a lot more competition in many, many places, including our own business. 30 years ago, there was 5 agencies, all multinationals, and that's not a lot of choice. Now you have the choice of 1,000 agencies you can go to, multinational, local, boutique, big, small. So you have to be good in what you do, and you have to be much more on your toes than you had to be 20, 30 years ago. And I think that's often quite interesting when you look at a lot of the big multinational companies, because now literally every multinational company has a huge domestic competitor. But I think often they still talk about it like it's a surprise to them. I mean, you're in this market for 30 years, you see Chinese companies evolving and developing. Surely you should notice at some point that some of these companies get pretty good in what they do. I think still multinationals struggle with that. And I mean, you look at it in automotive, for example, but many other categories, beauty category, consumer products, every big multinational now has a big domestic competitor. And they now, in many cases, have a product that's on par with their multinational competitor, sometimes even better. So you just have to be good in what you do if you want to compete here.
It's not just multinationals, it's also talent, right? A lot of local agencies, those are people who learn from you.
Yeah.
Right. How do you feel about that?
Actually, I always feel proud when I run into anyone that used to work in Ogilvy, because many of our clients used to work for us. Many of the leaders of other agencies, actually multinational and local, many of the great boutique agencies, most people at some point have worked in Ogilvy. So I think that's a great testament to, what we do here and that we've done something right. And Ogilvy has always been kind of called the University of Advertising. Always put a lot of effort into training our people, and I'm proud of that. And in many cases now these people have become competitors to us, but same thing. I think it forces us to just constantly evolve and try to be better in what we do.